Please note the following episode contains descriptions of assault and domestic abuse.
Brazen. Littleton, Colorado, 2013.
When I flew out to Colorado after he was arrested to bail him out, up until that point, he was very cold, standoffish. I thought he probably would feel better for a stranger he met on the street than he felt for me. But once he was bailed out and we spent like a day and a half together after his arrest, he was a little bit more of the person I knew.
Marcy Misiewicz, then 45 years old, was dealing with a tangle of emotions. For years, she'd endured the indignities of a Navy wife, a cheating husband who was never around, domestic abuse, and an institution that cared more for operational tempo than the security of her family. When she complained, even to senior Navy officers, she was told to endure it. Then, her husband, Captain Select Michael Misiewicz, became one of the first officers to be arrested in the Fat Leonard scandal. Marcy was in turmoil. She was a whistleblower who'd helped bring down Leonard. She'd never expected her actions would lead to Michael's arrest. But finally, she no longer felt voiceless.
And I think at that point, there was remorse, I think, there for him. There was none of the standoffish, meaning Marcy's the crazy person and he doesn't understand why I'm upset about this, that, and the other. That had kind of gone onto the wayside. And he admitted that his choices and his drive to do so well in the Navy was very detrimental to our marriage and to his family.
You must have felt vindicated.
There was a small amount of vindication there, yes.
Today, Marcy is 53, living in Shannon, a village of 750 people in rural Illinois, the area where she and Michael met over 3 decades ago. She's smart and articulate, but prone to self-doubt and blaming herself for what happened in her relationship. She's angry at what she sees as a cover-up that has spared the Navy admirals who were involved with Leonard. Marcy is in a much more precarious position. Despite her role in bringing down Leonard, she has been left financially insecure, forced to fight for pension money from the Navy. Now divorced, her ex-husband just released from jail. She's working in a bank after years of putting her own career on hold, scraping together cash for her 4 children's education. Marcy still loves the US Navy, but she doesn't buy the story that only a few bad apples like Michael are to blame. Do you think that unless the Navy really comes to grips with what happened in the Fat Leonard scandal, it's not going to be able to move on, right?
No, it's a huge bruise on the Navy. Yeah, they have to recover from it. I just don't know. It has to be more than a wrist slap, and it has to be more than figure out how someone like Leonard was able to weave his way in to weaken these otherwise, I don't know if weaken's the right word, but be able to sway these people who otherwise you would never imagine them to do these things. Like I would have never imagined Michael to do anything like this.
I'm Tom Wright, and this is Fat Leonard, a podcast from Project Brazen. I've been burrowing deep into the Leonard Francis story, trying to work out how a contractor could so deeply infiltrate the US Navy. In this episode, we are going to explore the human cost of the scandal. How was Leonard able to exploit weakness to make good people do bad things? Few set out to be criminals, especially someone like Michael Misiewicz, a soft-spoken American immigrant hero with a seemingly happy family life. Leonard loved The Godfather as a child, and now he built his mafia inside the Navy, a group of people who called themselves La Familia. What did it take to bring someone like Michael, who had given his life to the Navy, into the fold? And we'll hear how Marcy, unlike many Navy spouses, wasn't willing to turn a blind eye to the wrongdoing. Hello, a quick favor. We're conducting an audience survey, and we'd be really grateful if you could take just a few minutes and answer our questions. Please visit survey.prx.org/brazen to take the survey today. That's survey.prx.org/brazen. Thanks.
Sihanoukville, Cambodia, 2012.
I remember he was originally born in Cambodia. He was adopted and went to the U.S. Naval Academy. It's a famous story that, everybody talked about at the time. When he went back to Cambodia to meet his family, we were on the USS Blue Ridge when this happened.
Commander Michael Misiewicz, in his mid-40s, looked out from the deck of the Blue Ridge, the 7th Fleet's flagship, to the land of his birth, the strife-torn Southeast Asian nation of Cambodia, a place almost as foreign to him as the next man on board. It was a poignant homecoming to celebrate an extraordinary life, the kind of immigrant success story on which the American myth is built. The officers of the Blue Ridge climbed downstairs onto the pier, and Michael, in his crisp white uniform, 3 gold bands and a star on his epaulettes, saw his aunt waiting for him in a huddle. He moved toward the woman, in her mid-70s, bowed by illness, and they embraced. Other family members crowded around, Michael at the center of the group, his stern, well-proportioned face breaking into a smile. Captain Ron Carr, a fellow officer on the Blue Ridge, found the scene moving. That evening, there was a lavish party: food, drink, dancers, and a band.
And so that just looked pretty darn special. Knowing his career, knowing his background, that he had been born in Cambodia, it's an amazing, so to speak, rags to riches story. To go on to become a commanding officer of a U.S. naval warship, DDG, after coming from a place of poverty and being adopted by a U.S. family. Then he went on to the Naval Academy.
For all the heartwarming backstory, though, Ron didn't trust Michael, although he kept those feelings to himself.
It's 8 years ago, but just his personality, it came across as someone that I couldn't really connect with. I just never really connected with Mike Misiewicz.
One of Michael's jobs on the 7th Fleet staff was to manage the schedules of 60 ships and submarines, 150 aircraft, and 20,000 sailors in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. It was a powerful position. In Ron's eyes, Michael seemed secretive about the information he controlled.
I remember he would use the word close hold, like, don't tell anybody this, hey, be careful on that.
Ron's instincts were solid. Michael kept all kinds of secrets, from the Navy and from his family. And one of them was the identity of the benefactor who had paid for this lavish reunion.
As a U.S. Navy officer, I don't know how you get to the point that Commander Misiewicz could have gotten to, that could have allowed this to get so out of hand. And amazingly, I'll just say I must have been naive, how I didn't see this, how I did not realize what they were doing.
Back in Japan, where the USS Blue Ridge was based, Marcy was happy that her husband could reunite with his family. She had a newborn and 3 other children to take care of, and so hadn't been able to join this or other trips to Cambodia. So you missed out.
Yeah. But I distinctly remember him calling, as they were leaving Cambodia, and he called and he was in tears, and just that it was such an awesome experience and that we would all have to go back as a family, and it just left an impact.
Michael Misiewicz was born as Vanak Kem in Cambodia. During his childhood in the 1970s, the country was ravaged by the Khmer Rouge, a murderous group of Maoist guerrillas who wanted to take the country back to a Stone Age agricultural utopia. His family fled its village as the Khmer Rouge fighters approached, taking refuge in a stilt house over mosquito-infested waters in the nation's capital. His aunt landed work as a cleaner for Marina Misiewicz, an army administrative assistant at the US Embassy. The aunt took her nephew to play while she cleaned. Marina took a shine to the little boy, who ate popcorn and watched cartoons.
His father had some inkling that things were going bad with the Khmer Rouge, the imminence of that, and arranged for Marina to adopt Michael and bring him back to the States. I remember him telling me that when he was saying goodbye to his biological mother leaving Cambodia, and she was so upset that he told her, don't worry, I will go to the States and get a good education, and someday I'll buy you a big white house. So I think he always had that in the back of his head, that he wanted to fulfill that commitment.
Marina took Vanak Kem back to Lanark, Illinois, a town of 1,500 people, many of whom had never laid eyes on an Asian. The little boy worked hard to fit in. He took a new name, Michael Misiewicz, and learned to speak English with an American accent, slowly forgetting his Khmer. News from Cambodia was spotty, and letters to his family went unanswered. So she's from the same small town that you were from?
Correct. He was the only person of any ethnic background in the whole school. Everybody else looked like me. So he stood out, but I mean, he was gregarious, he was smart, he was personable, he was a good athlete, he was an excellent student, easily liked. So he stood out that way a lot. And all of his athletics that he took part in, people knew who he was.
What was he, a football player?
Football player, basketball, wrestling, baseball, all of it.
Michael adored his adopted mum, whom he idolized for making a huge sacrifice to bring him to America. He thanked her in a Memorial Day speech in Lanark in 2013.
She's been my personal heroine, and as I've stated today, today's not only about those that you lost, but what have you gained. And I want to thank my mom for her sacrifices to both myself and to give up her youth for allowing us to enjoy the freedoms today.
After high school, Michael enlisted in the Navy. He was a year above Marcy and would come back to Lanark on furlough. They had hung out as kids, and now a long-distance romance blossomed. As news of the Khmer Rouge genocide filtered out of Cambodia, Michael lived with the unfaltering weight of guilt. Around 1.8 million people had died in the killing fields, and he thought often about his family.
I think there was some amount of guilt, maybe, that he escaped some of the tragedy that his family endured, in Cambodia. His father perished because of the Khmer Rouge. He was murdered, killed by them. And one sister died of probably an illness that Western medicine could have taken care of at the time, but in war-torn Cambodia, that probably wasn't going to happen. And then another sibling was born after his dad died and perished as an infant because
in the killing fields.
Mm-hmm.
The guilt drove him to work hard to rise out of the enlisted ranks and become an officer.
If they said you had to be here at 6, he was there at 4:30. It got to be a source of frustration at times, but for me, especially when the kids came along. But yeah, he just put in the time. And he's very competitive, so that came into play too, I think.
Marcy married Michael after he graduated from the Naval Academy, and they moved around like all Navy families: Texas, San Diego, Washington, D.C. After high school, she'd taken a promising job at an insurance company in Milwaukee, but she gave that up and also shelved her plans to study business in college. While Michael did a tour in Iraq, for which he was awarded the Bronze Star, Marcy put her own ambitions on hold for the sake of her husband's career and for the good of the Navy. I contacted her on Facebook earlier this year, and at first she wasn't keen to engage. Reporters had been asking her for years to talk, but the wounds were still festering. Then we got chatting, and Marcy's story started to tumble out, a cathartic process after years of relegating her own happiness to that of others.
I made attempts to go back to school, and then just with moving and everything, I just worked clerical jobs, office positions, whatever I could find. And then I worked retail for several years just because that was easily mobile with his career.
She had young children and gave herself completely to rearing them while Michael was away at sea. He was on a career path to one day commanding his own ship. The fact he'd served as an enlisted man, not going straight to the Naval Academy, gave him away with the crew, and the family was proud.
You see the movies, the stereotypical officers who are screaming at people. You think of Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men where he's just screaming. There are definitely screamers. And I think he probably did at some point too, but he just kind of had a calm about him. And I had people over the years tell me that they respected him a lot, that they appreciated him because of the way he led the enlisted and that sort of thing.
Behind the facade, though, Michael felt like an imposter. How could he, a fatherless immigrant from Cambodia, one day run his own ship? Marcy began to ask why he was home less than the other officers.
Michael would always fall back on, well, he's probably smarter than me, or he's whatever. He knew he wanted to command at sea eventually, and he knew what he needed to do.
As he dealt with his own insecurities, Michael began to belittle Marcy.
I was never fit enough. I was never skinny enough. I was always too this or not enough that. I was a basket case.
Would he listen to your opinions or not really?
Sometimes, but no. He always told me that I was smarter than him, but that I lacked certain amounts of self-esteem or confidence, and that's probably true to a certain degree.
On one of his Asian tours, Michael allegedly began an affair with another sailor's wife. He and Marcy went to counseling, but he didn't show any remorse.
He said to our counselor, he's like, I know this sounds messed up, but he says, if I'm with Marcy, based on the feelings he has for this mistress, he feels like he's cheating on her, even though he's married to me. It's just a different mentality, I guess. I don't know. I mean, at the time, of course, I was like, that's just weird and not right.
Under military law, adultery is a court-martial offense. But Michael was a skilled officer, and in 2009, he got command of his own boat, the USS Mustin, and its 380-strong crew. The family left the US for the first time to a new life in Japan and a fresh start for the marriage. Then, he was moved to the USS Blue Ridge and onto the radar of Leonard Francis.
Manila, 2011.
No, they were with the girls. They were wrestling with the girls, I think. I wasn't there. It was Rufo was there. He was a clown.
The ringside bar in the Philippines capital has a full boxing ring in the center where a dance floor should be. Michael stood with Ed Rufo and other officers from the 7th Fleet, holding a beer as he watched the goings-on. In Manila, nightlife can be out of the ordinary. There was a Hobbit house, a Tolkien-themed bar set up by a former Peace Corps volunteer and staffed entirely by little people. Not to mention the scores of karaoke bars, fronts for brothels, that grew up to service a sizable US military presence after World War II. At the ringside bar, there was a bout between little people. Then women, dressed in revealing outfits, began to spar in a desultory fashion. Men came up and put on gloves and pretended to hit the women. The crowd pushed forward against the ropes, leering and shouting. Then it was Michael's turn to enter the ring. He ducked under the ropes. Quickly, his top came off, and he ended up mock wrestling with women. It was Valentine's Day. Someone snapped a shot of Michael on the floor of the boxing ring, wearing only his jeans. 2 Filipino women in blue and red boxing uniforms bending over him. The photo seems to be that they're about to take a shot off his body or something, some kind of like...
Yeah. Pictures speak 1,000 words always.
Ed Rufo had arranged for Michael and others from the Blue Ridge to party in this bizarre Manila bar. Arufo was the confident, slick Navy officer from New York who has pleaded guilty to conspiracy to defraud the US and is awaiting sentencing. He'd left the Navy, gone to Cambridge in the UK to study for a master's, joined Barclays for a while, and now was in Japan, working for Leonard's company. Outside the Navy, his job was to stay close to the 7th Fleet. Leonard had built out a mafia-like network in the 7th Fleet, reaching from the Chief of Staff down to petty officers, according to a grand jury charge that will go to trial next year. These conspirators, many of whom have pleaded not guilty, helped to push ships to ports that Leonard controlled, where he could charge exorbitant fees, according to the indictments. They overrode ships' complaints about Leonard's high costs, and they helped him win business over rival contractors. By now, Leonard had a near monopoly in the Pacific region, using his Navy conspirators to win contracts in Australia, Thailand, and the Philippines, as well as Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia. The scheme constantly needed new recruits, just like the mafia, as officers were rotated in and out of the 7th Fleet. In Manila, They were testing out Michael to see if he was the right kind of material. That night, Michael went home with a prostitute, paid for by Leonard, according to court documents. A few weeks earlier, according to an email exchange entered into court records, Leonard had written Arufo about Michael. We've got to get him hooked on something.
Because Misiewicz, he had value, He was like the number 2 guy in the scheduling department.
Arufo replied that Michael liked Japanese women, but they were costly, and suggested Leonard could fly him to Bangkok, or else he would take him to Tokyo. In a Facebook message, Arufo denied ever providing prostitutes to anyone. Leonard knew about the gossip on base about Michael's affair.
Well, if you look at Misiewicz, he's actually a really nice guy. A very gentle personality, friendly, great dad to his kids, womanizer.
And he knew Marcy wasn't happy.
Arufo basically kind of went in and, embedded her husband.
Arufo started to appear more at the Misiewicz's detached house on base at Yokosuka. Marcy had a bad feeling.
I think like I've told you and I've told many people, he kind of has that cheesy car salesman sort of schmarmy personality. He can talk to everybody from the janitor to the CEO and he's going to charm anybody.
Life on a US Navy base can be like a hothouse.
It's referred to a lot as a bubble there on base because it's still a little America on base.
Everyone knows each other's business. Affairs, problems kids are having at school, that kind of thing. And on the Yokosuka base, many Navy officers knew enough about Arufo and his relationship with Leonard to tell their wives to avoid him.
And I'm hearing other stories of people saying, oh yeah, my husband says, Ed is not someone you want to hang out with, steer clear.
Arufo tried to befriend Marcy, arranging for family tickets for the Lion King musical in Tokyo, according to court documents. Although Marcy enjoyed the show, she was a little surprised that Michael would accept the tickets from a representative of a Navy contractor.
I don't know because, he was always, in the past when people offered gifts or whatever, he was like, well, we can't do that because that's frowned upon or whatever. But when they talked about the Lion King tickets, I was under the impression that at some point we were paying Ed back.
Michael was spending more time with Arufo and Leonard, supposedly for dinners in Tokyo. She suspected women were involved, although he denied it, claiming she was paranoid and insecure. Arufo's presence became cloying.
He gave me the whole pep talk about, being a spouse in the Navy is the hardest job. I always tell Mike he needs to, punch out and go home and spend time with his family. Okay. So he's telling me that one sentence, and then the other sentence, he's making arrangements for him to have, prostitutes in Tokyo. This is just gross, disgusting.
Some of the 7th Fleet wives allegedly had no qualms about taking gifts from Leonard. One received a $8,400 Versace purse. Another, a $25,000 Ulysse Nardin watch, court records show. Some even allegedly helped rope others in. One woman, whose husband was an alleged conspirator, approached the wife of an official that Leonard wanted to bring in, offering her an expensive gift supplied by Arufo, according to an indictment. They called these operations shaping. Like wives in a mafia movie, it's easy to imagine these women turning a blind eye to their husband's infidelities, but enjoying the lifestyle.
They want to live that life. They wanted to have the good life that they could not have. They wanted the fine dining. They wanted the fine gifts, the hotel rooms, the sedans, the luxury cars, watches, handbags, fancy meals, alcohol, cigars.
Marcy, however, wasn't going to be a way to get to Michael. She was too principled and wary of Arufo, and their marriage was still strained from his affair. So they focused instead on Michael. The partying and the prostitutes helped, but they found another way in: Michael's need to see his Cambodian family. In mid-2011, Michael got word that his 72-year-old aunt in Cambodia was ailing. Leonard stepped in to pay for the trip, sensing this was his weak spot. Since reconnecting with his family, there was pressure to pay for so many flights. He knew taking from Leonard was wrong, but he also felt the pressure of the successful immigrant, the Navy commander. And maybe he was trying to assuage the guilt he'd felt since a child, the weight of having escaped the killing fields.
I asked him, how he got to Cambodia, and he basically told me by means that neither of us could speak of. So in my head, I'm like, okay, that's probably because of Ed, and then in turn, of course, Fat Leonard, because, their two names are synonymous with one another. I'm like, well, how deep is he in with this guy now?
A couple of weeks later, Leonard made his first demand: classified US Navy ship schedules for Australia. Michael sent them over using a new private Gmail account he'd set up for just this purpose. "We got him," Arufo emailed Francis. "You bet, Godfather," Leonard replied. Back in Penang, as a kid in the 1970s, Leonard had fantasized over The Godfather when it first came out. I asked him what he loved about the film.
Oh, how the family was so close-knit, and how much of, respect and power a single Don could have over the entire clan.
Michael started to hand over reams of ship schedules, and he intervened to send ships to ports where Leonard could charge more. "See, you ask, I deliver," he wrote Leonard. He began to call Leonard, who was 3 years older, Big Bro, in emails. And Leonard kept paying for the family to keep in touch. A miracle sent from heaven. But for Leonard, it was no more than leverage.
I flew his family back to Cambodia. I bought all the tickets and took his kids, flew them. I think it was twice. Went back to Cambodia to visit his family.
In his Memorial Day speech, Michael had warned his proud town about the dangers out there in the world.
This reminds me of a recent article I read about the type of people in our world. You either have wolves, sheep, or sheepdogs. For many, there's a peaceful acceptance of being a sheep and hoping the wolves won't get them.
He had set out to be a sheepdog, protecting the US from foreign threats. But as Michael sunk into dependency on Leonard, he looked more like the prey. Marcy and Michael were apart for months on end. On the base, Marcy worried neighbors were gossiping about his infidelities. One day, when he returned, the children noticed he didn't even hug her. She started to talk about divorce.
But leading up to that, I had told him, we really need to sit down and have a conversation. We need to figure this out. You've moved me and the kids overseas. We need to figure this out.
One day, Michael was laying on the couch at home, watching a Navy football game, when Marcy asked to go outside and talk. He was furious at being interrupted and exploded in a volcanic rage. She had never seen him like this in over 20 years of marriage.
Yeah, he grabbed me and pushed me up the stairs. And then, of course, there was no productive conversation after that. And it just kind of, I went my way, he went his way. And it wasn't until a couple days later that I had a friend notice that I had some bruising.
And he had never done something like that before?
No. Mm-mm.
Is it tempting to see that as part of, by that point, he's getting enmeshed in Leonard's web, right?
Yeah. I think there were many plates spinning at that point. And of course, I don't know that. I know that the Navy is stressful. But when you're, almost living a dual life at that point, I would imagine it's hard to keep everything spinning and not get stressed out about it.
Under pressure from her friend, Marcy reported the incident to the 7th Fleet Command. After an investigation, the Navy issued an order of protection, forcing Michael to live temporarily on the Blue Ridge, away from his family. Marcy declined to press charges, worrying about the embarrassment on base. But she applied to the Navy for her and the kids to be returned early to the US. A female Navy doctor on the base advised this would be prudent, given the toxic atmosphere at home, according to a copy of a letter to the 7th Fleet commanders. The Navy did not approve the request, instead ordering Michael to stay on the ship until the end of his tour. It seems to me that your happiness and safety and your family's was put under the Navy's need to keep a family together of somebody they considered to be a rising star or already a commanding officer. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, I mean, I felt like there was a little relevance given to what it was doing, how it was affecting me. As we touched on, as a fishbowl there, it's hard because you're trying to put on a happy face, but it's not, you've got all this stuff going on in the background. It was kind of brutal.
Leonard, too, got wind of the problem. An angry Marcy was going to make it more difficult for him to control Michael. So he supplied the commander with a Gucci handbag, a gift to give to his wife.
And I had to have asked him, where that came from. And I don't even really remember what he said. And I put it in my closet, and that's where it stayed. I've never used it.
Marcy's misery made little difference to Michael. He kept on partying with Leonard and Arufo at events that cost tens of thousands of dollars, and his star kept rising. The Navy even awarded him the Legion of Merit, a prestigious U.S. military award for his time in the 7th Fleet.
I mean, I was like, really, is this even the same person that I know that I was married to and had 4 children with?
I mean, does it get to this point that you can never really know anybody?
Yeah, I mean, there's that saying, gosh, you think you know a person. I mean, yeah, there's definitely some of that there.
Marcy stewed at home, emotionally wrung out, but also angered she could not relocate her family for another year.
It was definitely like the old boys club mentality, I felt like, to a certain degree with some of that. So it's like, let's just hush her up. And, if we do this protective order and that'll, appease her, that'll hush her up for a while.
But Marcy, as we'll hear later in the series, wasn't going to stay quiet. Not about Michael's infidelities, and not about all the gifts and trips he was clearly taking from Leonard. She didn't know everything, but she knew enough to go to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service.
Perhaps had they gotten me out of Japan sooner, maybe I wouldn't have met with NCIS. None of that part of it maybe wouldn't have happened. I don't know.
I've been asking myself why the Navy would protect someone like Michael after he struck Marcy. And the answer seems to be that Michael was very good at his job, a workaholic who kept his ship running no matter what. That's why Leonard continued to flourish, despite his personal cruelties toward Marcy and many other women in this story. And that's why I decided to track down Leonard's own former girlfriend, one who had paid a terrible price.
I said, we're going back to Philippines. You can stay with your family, your children, but let my children with me.
The loss of her children. How are you able to get the kids to the U.S.?
Everybody came legally, everybody knows, Uncle Sam knows, what I'm doing. For them, my children, my well-being is more important than anything else. I am the star witness.
Fat Leonard is a production of Project Brazen in partnership with PRX. For Audiation, the executive producer is Sandy Smollins. Mark Lotto is the co-producer and story editor. The producer is Island Meacham. Mixing and sound design is by Matt Noble.
From PRX.